Today we're going to be learning about topic 11, reaction mechanisms. Our learning goals for today are to explain what a reaction mechanism is and how it's determined. We should also be able to define and identify an elementary step as well as reaction intermediates. We should be able to explain the requirements of a plausible reaction mechanism, and if given a reaction mechanism, we should be able to figure out whether it is plausible or not. So we know that a balanced chemical equation gives us an overall summary of a chemical reaction. It tells us the reactants that are involved and the products that are actually being formed. We also get the stoichiometric relationships, meaning which ratio of these reactants come together to form X number of products. But it doesn't actually give us the whole story of what's going on during a reaction. What we can find is that chemical reactions are often able to be broken down into smaller steps, a sequence of simpler reactions that, when added together, add up to make up your overall balanced equation. And that's exactly what a reaction mechanism is, a series of elementary steps that do occur to make up a reaction. And in this case, an elementary step is the most basic step in a chemical reaction that cannot be broken down further. And it typically only involves one or two entities, and very rarely three. An analogy of this would be if we're thinking about conducting a lab. If you're going through and carrying out a lab, you have a whole series of steps that need to be done to complete it. And those steps will let you actually go through to carry out whatever the purpose of that experiment is. Now, each one of those basic steps could be identified as an elementary step, the most basic step that tells you how to conduct the lab. Chemical reactions are similar, where they can be broken down into simpler reactions, and all of those will add up to make up the overall reaction that we see. Reaction mechanisms are determined experimentally. It's not something that you can just look at an overall balanced equation and figure out what it is. So chemists will actually perform experiments to provide clues for the reaction mechanism. Now, how to actually do that is outside of the scope of this course. It's something that you might look at in first year, definitely in second year if you continue on with chemistry. Now, to understand a chemical reaction completely, we really need to know its mechanism. It allows us to know exactly what is going on during that reaction. Right? And one of the main purposes for studying reaction rates is to learn as much as we can about a chemical reaction. Now, we can think about why this might be important. Right? If we're thinking about in disease where it's caused by a protein that is no longer functioning, by understanding how it works, the mechanism by which it carries out what it needs to do, scientists can go through to try to develop treatments to try to prevent it from doing what it's doing. Alternatively, if an industry is trying to synthesize a chemical, by understanding the steps, they can try to optimize it to try to make it go more efficiently, which would allow the company to be able to save money. So there's a whole wide range of reasons why we would want to understand the mechanism of a reaction. And ultimately, what it'll do is it'll give us more information in terms of what needs to happen for that reaction to occur. And then we can take whatever steps we need to try to optimize it or make it go a little bit faster. So we're going to go and try to analyze a reaction mechanism a little bit further. So let's consider a reaction where we have nitrogen dioxide, NO2, reacting with carbon monoxide. We're told experimentally that the rate law expression for this reaction is R is equal to K times the initial concentration of NO2 raised to the power of 2. And this was determined experimentally. Now, we have this balanced equation. The mechanism of this reaction, which was determined experimentally, was figured out to be broken down into two steps. The first step is where NO2 and NO2, so two separate NO2 molecules react to form NO3 and NO. This is a slow reaction step. And then there's a second step where the NO3 that was generated reacts with carbon monoxide, one of the other reactants, to generate NO2 and CO2. Now, in here, Since the first step in this reaction mechanism is the slowest step, it is going to determine the speed of this overall reaction. Okay, and it's going to be called the rate determining step. The slowest step in any reaction mechanism will determine how fast that reaction happens. A nice analogy that I like to think about is if you think of an assembly line to make cars. If you're going through and you have, say, 10 steps to make a car, hypothetically, and let's say the first 9 happen really, really quickly, but the last one takes 1 hour to do. Okay, it's going to be that last step that's going to determine how fast it takes to build that car, because even if you have millions of all the other steps built up, it still needs to finish that last step. So it's always going to be the slowest step that's going to determine how fast the reaction is going to happen, and that's going to be called the rate determining step. Okay. So the rate determining step is the step in a reaction that determines the rate of the overall reaction, the slowest step in a reaction mechanism. And actually, that is the step that's going to be explained using the rate law expression. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. So if we analyze this reaction a little bit further, so if we're going through and looking at this reaction and we're going through trying to add them together, we're going to notice, so if we're going to add them together like we did with Hess's law, we're going to notice here that, let me see here, when we're doing this and we're adding these together, okay, the NO3 is present on both the reactant and product side and will actually be canceled out and not included in the overall balanced equation. So in this case, NO3 is identified as a reaction intermediate, okay? A species that is neither a reactant nor a product, but is formed and consumed during the reaction sequence. I know you're probably looking at this and saying that NO2 also cancels out, but there's still an NO2 here left over. So that's why NO2 would not be considered a reaction intermediate. Okay, so going through, if we're adding up the individual steps, the elementary steps of a reaction mechanism, anything that cancels out is called a reaction intermediate. So it's generated during the reaction, but then it's actually being consumed again and will not show up in the overall balanced equation. Okay, so in here, we're going to find that every elementary step will typically only have 1 or 2 entities in it. Sometimes it might have 3, but it's very rare. So most reaction steps have 1 or 2 reactant entities. Okay. Having 3 is rare, and the reason for that is probability. Because it's the most basic step, for that reaction to take place, all of the entities that are involved in that reaction need to collide together with enough energy in the right orientation to allow a reaction to happen. As we add more colliding reactant entities, the probability of that happening decreases. So whenever we have a basic elementary step, it'll typically only have 1 or 2 entities, sometimes 3, but definitely not 4 or 5. Now, when we're writing rate laws, we know that we can't write out rate laws by looking at an overall balanced equation for a reaction. However, rate laws can be written directly from the balanced equation representing elementary steps. So as we're going through, if we have an elementary step that is made up of 1 reactant going to products, the rate law expression for that will be the rate is equal to K times the concentration of A raised to the power of 1. If we have an elementary step where we have 2 of the identical reactants coming together to form products, the rate law expression will be the rate is equal to K times the concentration of A squared. And it's going to be squared because there are 2 reactants in this reaction that are identical. If we have A reacting with B, so 2 different reactants coming together, our rate law expression is going to be R is equal to K times the concentration of A raised to the power of 1 and the concentration of B raised to the power of 1. So if we have an elementary step, we can write out a rate law expression for it, and that will mimic the rate determining step, and we'll see that coming up. So the requirements for a plausible reaction mechanism are twofold. First, if we add up all of the elementary steps in the reaction, it must give the overall balanced equation for the reaction. And two, the reaction mechanism must agree with the experimentally determined rate law. So the slowest step, which we said was the rate determining step, must match the rate law expression. And we'll see an example of that coming up. So if we consider the previous example that we looked at, we saw that there were two steps. So if we add these two together, we're going to find that NO3 cancels out, and that was what we classified as a reaction intermediate. In here, one of the NO2s also cancel out, but then we're left over with NO2, carbon monoxide, NO, and CO2. And that matched the overall balanced equation that we had. So the first requirement for a correct reaction mechanism is met. So these two elementary steps, which was the proposed mechanism, matches the overall balanced equation that we were initially given. Now, in here, the second requirement was that the rate law expression must match the slowest step. So in here, the first step is the slowest step. Okay, so going through, the rate law expression for the first step would be R is equal to K times the concentration of NO2 to the 2. And remember, we can write this out because it's an elementary step. Now, this was also what the rate law expression was determined for this reaction that we looked at initially. So the slowest step matches the rate law expression. So this reaction mechanism does satisfy the two requirements that we mentioned earlier. Now, we're going to go through and try two sample problems to try to reinforce this concept. So in here, nitrile fluoride gas, NO2F, is a strong oxidizer that is sometimes used as a rocket propellant. Nitrile fluoride gas can be synthesized from gaseous nitrogen dioxide and fluorine. The balanced equation for the reaction of nitrogen dioxide gas and fluorine gas is 2NO2 plus F2 yields 2NO2F. Experimentally determined rate law is R is equal to K times the concentration of NO2 raised to the power of 1 and F2 raised to the power of 1. And we're provided with a two-step mechanism. And we're asked to say, does this mechanism satisfy the two requirements for a plausible reaction mechanism? Now, the one thing you got to keep in mind is whenever we're doing these types of questions, you can see we're given a lot of information. You're never going to have to come up with a mechanism on your own that's outside of the scope of this course. All that we're going to have to do is analyze proposed reaction mechanisms, see if they're actually plausible. So in here, we needed to answer and say, if we add up these two elementary steps, does it match the overall balanced equation? So if we go through and we add them together, we're going to see that we do actually get a match for the overall equation. So we get two NO2s, F2, and in this case, the F here that's generated cancels out. Now, what would that be called? If you thought reaction intermediate, you're absolutely correct. So we know the first requirement is met. Now the second requirement. So analyze in here, we're trying to determine whether the mechanism agrees with the experimentally determined rate law equation. So here we have our mechanism. This was what the experimentally determined rate law was. R is equal to K times the concentration of NO2 to the 1 and F2 to the 1. If we look, this here is our slowest step. If we look at the two reactants that are here, because it's an elementary step, we can write out a rate law expression. We have NO2 and F2. So that does actually match the experimentally determined rate law. So the second criteria is met, and this is a plausible reaction mechanism. Sample problem 2. The rate law equation for a chemical reaction was found to be rate is equal to K times the concentration of NO to the 1 times the concentration of Cl2 to the 1. And then we have this two-step mechanism. We're asked to solve for the overall reaction, identify the intermediates, determine the slowest step, and the rate law equation for the fast step. See if you can take a moment to try it on your own. So for the overall reaction, we need to go through and add them together. And if we do that, we can see that we have two NOs. So here's one here, there's two. We have Cl2, but then we're going to cross out NoCl2. Okay, so we get an overall balanced equation of 2NO plus Cl2 yields 2NoCl3. 2NoCl, sorry. Seeing as we crossed out NoCl2 on when we were adding them together, that would make it a reaction intermediate. Now, if we go back and we're trying to determine the slowest step of the mechanism, I do want to go back to the initial slide so we can see this a little bit clearer. So in here, we're told that this is our rate law expression. So that should match the slowest step. So what we're trying to do is see if we can find these two reactants in our slowest step. So let's see here. If we're going through, we see NO and Cl2. So this step here must be our slowest step because it matches our rate law expression. The last part asks us to determine the rate law equation for the fastest step. So in here, that's going to be this expression here. So it's simply going to be R is equal to K times the concentration of NoCl2 to the 1 times the concentration of NO raised to the power of 1. Let me pull that up here so you guys can see that. So that ends off our lesson on reaction mechanisms. So we should, by the end of this, be able to explain what a reaction mechanism is and how it's determined, be able to define and identify elementary steps and reaction intermediates, explain the requirements for a plausible reaction mechanism, and analyze a proposed reaction mechanism to see if it's actually plausible. Like we said, you're going to be given most of the information. You're not going to have to come up with a mechanism on your own. We're just going to have to go through and analyze it.